Every city has its legends. In London, the Kray Twins ruled the East End. In Glasgow, the Razor Gangs carved their names into history. And in Manchester, it was the Quality Street Gang, a group so notorious, so mysterious that police, journalists, and even rival criminals could never quite decide whether they were a real criminal syndicate or just a band of flashy lads from the pub. At the center of this myth stood Jimmy the Weed Donnelly, sharp dresser, fast talker, and the unofficial spokesman for Manchester's underworld. Donnelly's story is not just about crime, it's about reputation, survival, and the blurred line between folklore and fact. This is the story of Jimmy Donnelly, the man who became the face of the Quality Street Gang. Jimmy Donnelly was born into the post-war streets of Manchester, a city marked by bomb damage, poverty, and working-class resilience. The son of Irish immigrants, he grew up in neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce, but toughness and wit could carry you far. As a boy, Jimmy earned his nickname, the Weed, not because of drugs, but from a childhood incident when a teacher called him a weed for his small build. Instead of shrinking from it, Jimmy embraced the insult. By turning it into a badge of honor, he revealed a lifelong trait, the ability to control the narrative. By his teenage years, Donnelly was already well known in local pubs and boxing halls. He had charm, he had nerve, and he knew how to make people remember his name. Those traits would later prove more valuable than any weapon. To understand Donnelly, you need to understand Manchester in the 1950s and 60s. Unlike London, where the Krays held a rigid grip, Manchester's underworld was fluid. Doormen, bookmakers, thieves, and fixers all rubbed shoulders in a city buzzing with nightlife and working-class pubs. Illegal betting shops thrived, protection rackets took root in dance halls, and pubs doubled as headquarters for deals both shady and social. Violence was never far away, but unlike the organized structures of London or Liverpool, Manchester's criminal world had looser rules. It was here that the Quality Street Gang began to take shape, not as a traditional mob, but as a circle of men who projected influence through swagger, wealth, and reputation. It began in a pub. A group of sharply dressed lads often gathered at the Brown Bull in Salford. Their flashy style earned them the nickname Quality Street Gang, after the colorful chocolates. Beneath the name were real operators, tough street figures, doormen, and businessmen with citywide connections. Jimmy Donnelly soon became their spokesman, always ready with a quip that kept the mystique alive. To police, they were dangerous. To locals, folk heroes, to Jimmy, just mates making money together. Jimmy Donnelly stood out from other gangsters. He cultivated ties with journalists, detectives, even politicians, never confirming or denying the gang's existence, only feeding the mystery. When accused of rackets, he'd grin. We're just lads having a drink. Impeccably dressed, he projected sophistication even when whispers of extortion followed him. In a world where reputation mattered as much as violence, Jimmy turned image into a weapon. The gang couldn't escape comparisons with the Kray Twins. Stories claim the Krays tried pushing into Manchester but were warned off. Jimmy said they once offered a partnership, but he told them Manchester wasn't for sale. True or not, the tale spread, painting him as the man who kept the Krays out, a reputation that gave his crew serious leverage. The Quality Street Gang didn't just pose in pubs. They dominated nightclub security, giving them influence over drugs, gambling, and protection rackets. They also invested in taxis, pubs, and clubs, legitimate fronts mixed with street muscle. Not known for big heists, their strength was networks and intimidation. Unlike the headline-hungry Krays, they stayed just low-key enough to avoid major crackdowns while keeping their grip firm. For decades, Greater Manchester police kept files on Donnelly and his crew, but pinning charges on them was notoriously difficult. Witnesses refused to testify, either out of loyalty or fear. Businesses paid protection money but rarely complained. That changed in the 1970s when senior police officers began pushing harder. The gang's high profile, coupled with suspicions of drug trafficking and extortion, made them targets. But even then, convictions were rare. Donnelly himself was arrested multiple times but always walked free. To the public, this added to his legend. Jimmy the Weed seemed untouchable. To the police, it was infuriating evidence of how deep the gang's influence ran. One of the most controversial episodes linked to Donnelly was the Stalker Affair of the 1980s. John Stalker, a senior police officer investigating alleged misconduct in Northern Ireland, was suddenly accused of having connections to Donnelly and the Quality Street Gang. Though Stalker denied any wrongdoing and was later cleared, The scandal exposed how deeply Jimmy's name had penetrated the political and law enforcement world. The very suggestion that a top police officer might be compromised by Manchester's underworld showed the extent of the gang's reputation. For Jimmy, the controversy was another reminder that sometimes the myth of the quality street gang was as powerful as reality. By the late 1980s and 1990s, the landscape of crime in Manchester was changing. The rise of narcotics, particularly heroin and later crack cocaine, shifted power to younger, more violent gangs. Drive-by shootings and turf wars replaced the old-style pub-based rackets. Jimmy Donnelly and his contemporaries represented an older generation of criminals, men who preferred intimidation and influence over chaotic street violence. As Manchester became dubbed Gunchester in the 1990s, the quality street gang style of operation seemed almost old-fashioned. Still, Jimmy retained respect. Even the new wave of gangs knew his name, and many treated him with deference. But the days of untouchable pub kings were gone. Chapter 10. Later Years and Reflections. In later life, Jimmy "the Weed" Donnelly leaned into his role as a storyteller. He gave interviews, wrote memoirs, and appeared in documentaries, recounting tales of the quality street gang with a mix of humor and nostalgia. To some, he remained a dangerous man who had profited from fear. To others, he was a local legend, a man who outwitted both the Krays and the police. Donnelly himself never fully revealed the truth. He preferred to keep the mystique alive. He lived long enough to see himself mythologized in books, films, and even songs. By the time of his death, Jimmy the Weed had become less a gangster and more a symbol of Manchester's rough glamour, a reminder of a bygone era. So what was Jimmy Donnelly's real legacy? On one level, he was a criminal, a man tied to extortion, racketeering, and the darker sides of Manchester nightlife. On another level, he was a master of image, turning himself and his friends into legends while leaving their exact deeds in the shadows. The quality street gang's reputation endured not because of court convictions or body counts, but because of storytelling, rumor, and fear. Jimmy Donnelly understood better than anyone that in the world of organized crime, perception can be more powerful than reality. Jimmy, the Weed. Donnelly never ran an empire like Genghis Khan or commanded armies like the mafia bosses of New York, but in Manchester, his name carried weight, his smile carried menace, and his legend carried on. The pubs of Salford and the streets of Manchester still whisper his name. Was the quality street gang truly an organized crime syndicate, or just a bunch of flashy lads who liked being feared? The truth may never be fully known, but one thing is certain: Jimmy the Weed Donnelly turned himself into a living myth. And in the world of gangland history, myths can be more dangerous and more enduring than any fact. Thanks for watching this deep dive into the story of Jimmy the Weed Donnelly and the quality street gang. If you enjoyed uncovering the truth behind one of Manchester's most infamous legends, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring you more untold stories from the shadows of history's underworld.